So we've seen that Theaetetus endorses a specific claim about what it means to know, namely that knowing is perception. What Socrates does is suggest that this view of what it means to know actually rests on a particular view of the way the world is, or the way the universe is, or the way that things in general are. So ultimately, what we see is that there's a specific relationship between what we can call epistemology and metaphysics that Socrates wants to identify. So what are these? Epistemology, the term comes from two Greek words, episteme, which means knowledge, and logos, which means account. So epistemology literally means an account of what knowing is. It's the philosophical discipline that addresses questions about the nature of knowledge. So Theaetetus gives us a specific epistemological claim when he identifies that knowledge is perception. So there are other epistemologies that we might find or that we might try to identify. Socrates will ultimately advocate for different ones later on in the dialogue. But so far we're dealing with a specific epistemology, or a specific account of knowledge, that knowledge is perception. So what's metaphysics? Metaphysics comes from Greek roots as well, has two Greek roots. The first is meta, which means beyond or after, and the second physis, which means nature. You might recognize that word from physics. It's the same root. So there's speculation about where these terms, or where the term metaphysics comes from. It might be something that actually refers to the subject matter, that metaphysics is about the things that are beyond the natural world or at the basis of the natural world. It could just be that these terms seem to come from Aristotle, and he wrote a book that's called the Metaphysics, and it might just have that name because it came in Aristotle's works after another book named the Physics. In any case, the source of the term isn't that important. The important thing is how we're going to use that word and how it's typically used. So metaphysics is the domain of philosophy that asks the most comprehensive questions about the most basic things. So it aims to provide an account of everything. So not just of what particular set of objects are like. So it's not like, say, sociology, right? Sociology claims to provide an account of what social institutions and practices are like. It's not like biology. Biology aims to provide an account of what living things are like. Instead, metaphysics aims to provide an account of everything. So it's supposed to be exhaustive. It's supposed to be about all that we find in the universe. And it aims to provide an account of those things in as simple terms as possible. So it wouldn't simply be enough to say that everything is. Instead, you would want to say what everything is like. So to actually give an explanation of what everything is. That's what metaphysics aims to do. So it aims to be comprehensive, to be about everything, and it aims to account for things in terms of, in the most simplest terms that it can. So Socrates' claim is that this epistemology that Theaetetus has offered, and that we've seen Protagoras offered before Theaetetus, typically rests on a specific metaphysics. So this claim about what knowledge is like, namely that's perception, is often linked to a particular view about what the ultimate nature of the world is. And that metaphysics is one that identifies the ultimate nature of things as being motion or change. So the claim is that what there is ultimately in the universe is motion. That the fundamental character of the universe is to be in flux. So we can contrast this metaphysics with another, which says that no, what there ultimately is similarity, that there's unity, and that things are fundamentally unchanging. That view was advocated by a philosopher who came before Socrates named Parmenides. Parmenides said that everything is one, and that motion and change and diversity and distinction, those are really only apparent. What there ultimately is one thing that is fixed and unchanging. So Theaetetus, according to Socrates, doesn't hold that kind of metaphysics. Instead, he holds this metaphysics that holds that everything is in flux. And that view was actually held by another ancient philosopher who disagreed with Parmenides, named Heraclitus. So Heraclitus advocated this metaphysics of flux and change. He's famous for a number of paradoxical or puzzling claims. One of the most famous claims of Heraclitus, and this gets at this idea that everything is flux, he claimed that one can't step into the same river twice. So why would you think that? Why would you think that you couldn't step into the same river twice? And Heraclitus' view seems to be this. A river is constituted by water that flows, right? That's what a river is. But if you actually think about what the river itself is, if it consists of the water, then it's itself something that's constantly changing, right? Because the water molecules, the little bits that constitute the river, those are themselves constantly in motion. And you could think about it this way, right? If I want to step into the Ohio in Cincinnati, the water molecules that pass by my feet today will be different from the water molecules that pass by my feet if I try to step in the river 3 days from now. So Heraclitus's argument is that what the river it's composed of things that are constantly in motion, and that means that it's technically not the same river when I step into it today as it will be if I step in it from 3 days from now. So this is supposed to be true, obviously not just of rivers, but Heraclitus thought that we could extend this claim to be about everything. So think about yourself, right? You're composed of a bunch of material stuff, but there's significant turnover in the material stuff that composes you, right? Your hair grows, for example. So your hair today is not the same as your hair, say, 6 months ago, right? It might be totally different hair. So how can we say that it's still your hair, that there's still one thing there? Heraclitus and people like him want to say that it's really only apparent that there is consistency and similarity over time. Really what we find is that similarity, that appearance of things being fixed and constant, that's only an appearance, and it veils something more fundamental. Um, and one implication is that on this account, this is something that Socrates identifies, for example, at 157b, is that we should get rid of talk of how things are, talking about things in terms of what they are, or in terms of being. Instead, on this account, the most real thing isn't what something is, but instead what it becomes. So the argument is that we should replace talk of being with talk of becoming, because becoming, coming to be, change, flux, alteration, that's the fundamental character of the universe and of the natural world. So Socrates suggests that this metaphysics of change actually supports Theaetetus's epistemology. So the idea that knowledge is really perception, Socrates wants to say that that's not just accidentally connected to this picture of the natural world and to the ultimate nature of things, but instead it's of a piece with it. So the idea is that if we adopt this metaphysics of change, where what things are is fundamentally changing and in flux, it simply makes sense that we're going to think that knowledge is something like perception. And what Socrates aims to do from 156 through 156a to 157a is to offer an account of how perception works that explains it just in terms of motion. So the picture that Socrates thinks we would need to get away from is one where perception is of one fixed thing by a perceiver. Right? So the idea behind this metaphysics of flux is that there aren't really fixed things. So for example, when I look at my cup, it seems like what I see is something that's fixed and permanent and unchanging. I've had this cup for years. And likewise, it seems like I, the perceiver, am something fixed and unchanging, right? I have the capacity to sight. For sight, I've had it for as long as I can remember. How can we give an explanation of perception without that idea that there's a fixed object that I perceive and that I am something fixed and my capacities are something fixed? So the thing I'd like you to do now is to have a look especially at the paragraphs from 156d through e, and look at Socrates' example. How does he explain the example of seeing something white that appeals not to the idea that there are fixed objects out there that we perceive and that we as knowers are ourselves fixed and unchanging? How does he give an account of perception that explains it in terms of fundamental motions? So have a look at that account, and then you can come back and pick up with the study guide.